Irving, are you hearing me?
I'm doing wonderful. There is an echo in your voice.
All right, I think it's rectified now.
Wonderful.
Excellent. Well, Irving, let me welcome you to the podcast. It's a brand new podcast. It's called Four Corners, the Dread Podcast, and you are our first guest on the podcast. Well, let me just welcome you again. And you're here on the occasion of the 23rd anniversary of the passing of our hero, brother Rosie Douglas, the fifth Prime Minister of Dominica. It's 23 years now since his passing. What are your thoughts in opening?
Well, let me, before I express any thoughts, let me thank you, Albert, and your wonderful wife, Pimpy, for the great work you've been doing in uplifting the consciousness
Okay.
of persons worldwide about Rastafari, about working towards unity. Many of your persons who've read your books or your listeners may not know that you've been writing conscious poetry since 1982 with your first booklet called Honorable Natty Dread in honor of Bob Marley. A few
And
years
also
after,
Kabinda.
Kabinda,
Yeah, also
very well
Kabinda.
received. You've done a lot of good work. You've written about unity in Dominica. You've written about Dominica trying to get rid of the tribalism that unfortunately afflicts it as we speak. And you have been a good ambassador, not only for Dominica, but for humanity. And let me commend you on the great work you've been doing. And let me also thank you for inviting me to be a guest in your podcast. I can think of no better subject than Roosevelt Douglas. Roosevelt Douglas, born in 1941, died unfortunately in October of 2000. But during that passage of time, 59 years when he was with us, he made a tremendous contribution to the upliftment of Black people, not only in Africa and in the diaspora. I can indicate to you as we speak that when we speak of Pan Africanism in the 20th century, we think of about a number of greats. We think of, for example, the great CLR James. We think of Amy Caesar. We think of Marcus Garvey. We think of Dr. Walter Rodney. We think of a number of these distinguished persons who left it an indelible mark on the parchment of anti-colonial struggles. But one of the open secrets is the tremendous work done by Rosie Douglas. I can indicate to you without any fear of contradiction that no other Black revolutionary of the 20th century did more in terms of work to achieve the liberation as best as he could of Africans and Africans in the diaspora. He may not have made the kind of theoretical or literary contribution of the great CLR James, Dr. Rodney, Franz Fanon, for example, Amy Caesar. But in terms of practice, in terms of the work he did, which is still to be unearthed, his work in the Libyan inspired Mathaba to free or to provide assistance to liberation movements all over, in my view, Albert Williams, is unparalleled in the modern history of anti colonialism. So I think it is a fitting subject that you have decided on to focus on your inaugural podcast, and I commend you for that.
Well, thank you, Irving, for your opening remarks. Um, your book has come into its fore with me in that doing my research for my next edition of the Dread Rastafari in Ethiopia, I turned to your book as one of the resource sets, and I was kind of really I won't say surprised, but very revealing some of the closeness that Rosie had with the Dread movement, because during the time when he was incarcerated, because of the Sir George Williams unity protest, and he was imprisoned. It was the same time that Cabinda, Desmond Trott, and Roy Mason themselves were picked up on this trumped up charge of the American. And I read in your book that he wrote expressing concern even as he himself was incarcerated. And later on, when he returned to Dominica in 1976, he also continued to support the campaign to free Desmond Trotter. And it's that kind of information that we need to disseminate about Rosie, his activism from a very early age. Because when you reach in your 60s, things that you were doing in your 20s, they kind of get forgotten about. A lot of the people that you would have been associated with would have gone to different areas, some would have passed away. And when the older you get, the more lonely you get, the more the newcomers to your life will be with you rather than those people that were with you when you're in your teens, developing your hard idea. But for Rosie to become the fifth Prime Minister of Dominica was in itself a feat. Take us a little bit back to Rosie Douglas, the teenager, as you reveal in your book, and try to explain to the people why recognition beyond any means is worthwhile for a Dominican like Rosie Douglas.
Rosie was exceptional in many respects, Albert. He was to the manner born, as you might say in England. His father was very prosperous, not only by Dominican standards. His father owned a vast estate. He owned businesses, very enterprising. His father subscribed to the old Victorian ethic that you should work hard, you should save your money, you should go to church every day. And he placed the white colonial on a pedestal. And that is the world in which Rosie grew up. But Rosie, from a very early age, he manifested a great degree of compassion for those who toiled on his father's 600-acre estate. And his compassion, his care and concern for the poor and for the laboring population was not engendered by socialism or Marxism. It was ingrained in him at a very early age in Dominica. And the book revealed a number of instances where Rosie expressed that concern when he went to study agriculture in Toronto, Ontario. It was with the view, according to his father, of coming back to run and to manage the estate. But Rosie was caught in the turbulence of the 1960s, as so many of his compatriots and so many of black students in North America, particularly America and Canada in the 60s, to the point that he abandoned any studies in agriculture after he gained his diploma and gravitated to the Sir George Williams University in Montreal, where he became very much involved in the activism, black activism of the time. And again, just to enlighten your listeners, there was in January 1969 a protest by black students who were protesting the unfair treatment meted out to some West Indian students by a white professor, who it was alleged was grading them in a fashion which ensured that they failed a particular course, biology, thereby aborting their hopes to graduate to medical school. And there was this protest, and during the protest, Rosie was one of the leaders. Rosie always showed an uncanny ability to use the press to bring to the fore the struggles of black people in Montreal and in Canada during the period. And suffice it to say that after the Montreal police raided the computer center where the protest had been staged, a vast fire enveloped the computer center, causing over $1 million of damage. Suffice it to say, in the subsequent roundup of protesters, some 97 of them were arrested. Rosie was identified as one of the original leaders. The harsh hand of the justice system in Canada at a time basically was used to keep Rosie in check, so to speak. There was a trial. Rosie and two others And of those three, he received the harshest penalty of 2 years in custody, less 1 day. And he was subject to almost immediate deportation or impending deportation after he served his sentence and after he was paroled. In the book, I showed how the system was used in a very cynical and illegal fashion sometimes to ensure that Rosie was convicted of something, thereby setting the grounds for his eventual deportation, which is exactly what happened in April of 1976. But before he was deported, he was incarcerated in 1973, and he was released on parole, as I said, actually, I'm wrong. He was incarcerated, then he appealed it, and then he had to serve his sentence from on about 1974 to 1975 in the fall when he was released. During the time he spent out of custody, Rosie spent a significant amount of time advocating on behalf of racialized persons in Toronto, not just Black West Indians, but also Africans, also Indians who were about to be deported. He also became a stalwart supporter of the indigenous movement within Canada in the 70s. In fact, he was actually made an honorary chief by a group in an Ontario town. But he was seen as a threat to the Canadian body politic. And the weight of the legal system or the administrative system was brought to bear against him and to ensure that he would be deported. It was a form of ideological cleansing. He was regarded as an incorrigible communist who could not be saved. Rosie was actually offered a deal. If you apologize for what happened in 1969, January, at the Sir George Williams University, we will not deport you. And it is a reflection of the strength of character of this extraordinary human being that he refused, thereby ensuring his eventual deportation. And Rosie was deported.
Once Rosie was in prison, he also published a book from chains to change. Tell us about his experiences, because you also did some other work whilst he was in the prison as well.
Rosie did a fair amount of work in prison. He wrote a long booklet on prison reform. Even as early as the 1970s, he raised concerns about the disproportionate incarceration of racialized persons, Black people, indigenous people. Long before that became an issue, a rallying cry for persons who were concerned about the inherent unfairness of the justice system. Rosie also gave interviews with organizations, progressive organizations, I should say. You're absolutely right. He started work on Change, a book on Dominica, a book decrying and critiquing the capitalist or still the remnants of the colonialist system in Dominica, and even took positions which alienated him from his own father, because he called for the balkanization of the Hampstead estate, the enfranchisement of workers, the effects of multinational companies, the effects of capitalism in Dominica, and he cried or he advocated for a breakdown of that system to be replaced by a system where workers are empowered to realize their dreams and their ambition. So while in prison was not for him a space where he retreated into isolation, where he became a repentant citizen, so to speak. It was a place or a space which he used to broaden the horizons, the intellectual horizons of persons marginalized, racialized, penalized, and that is very much part of his legacy. Many persons say they hold or they maintain that Rosie left no body of work, that Rosie was an opportunist and so on. That assessment, Albert Williams, is totally contrary to the reality. It is inconsistent with the literature. It's inconsistent with what he's written. It's not everyone who may be a prodigious scholar or intellectual, as I said, is C.L.R. James, for example. But Rosie held his own, although not at the same level of these Pan Africanists. But what he lacked in terms of intellectual output was more than compensated by the prodigious work he did with the Mathaba. From on or about 1982, after his first defeated the Poles in 1980, to on or about 1997, 3 years before he achieved this monumental triumph at the Poles in October of 2000. In terms of the work Rosie did in Libya as the head of that group, as you may know, Albert, he was instrumental in organizing or in helping to fund liberation movements all over the world, not just in Africa, not just in the Caribbean, but also in Latin America. He also helped to empower indigenous movements in Canada, in the United States, in Australia. He organized that many of these folks would be brought to Libya, where they were exposed to progressive thinking. Persons on the right cynically say that he was introducing them to military training, to mold them into terrorists. But that is just the interpretation of persons who had this morbid hatred of Libya. His most seminal achievement, as I detail in the book, was to switch financial assistance in South Africa to a group, the name escapes me, to transfer it from that group to the ANC. And Libya, an unknown fact, is that during the heights of apartheid in South Africa, Libya channeled millions of dollars to the ANC. In fact, I can tell you that Nelson Mandela was so appreciative of that financial assistance that when he was inaugurated, when he was sworn in, Rosie occupied the front seat with other ANC dignitaries in recognition of the great work he had done with the ANC in terms of providing them financing. He also helped to provide significant assistance to an organization closer to where you are, the IRA. The IRA, in fact, I quoted in the book a comment by an IRA official that in their annual conferences, Rosie attended more of those conferences than this IRA leader, and I can't remember his name. But again, all that is detailed in that the book that you have referred to, the book I wrote about Rosie Douglas. More work will have to be done in those aspects of Rosie's life. But in terms of the organizations, in terms of the transformative work that he did in Africa, in South America, in the Caribbean, and elsewhere, Rosie's work is unparalleled. It is something which is hidden in plain sight. And we have an obligation to make sure that the younger generation understand the work of this gentleman, irrespective of whatever internal contradictions that he may have manifested. And for those who seek to harp on those inconsistencies and contradictions, let me address them, or let me just say something to them which has biblical significance. Those who are without sin, let them cast the first stone, my friend.
And Dr. Andre, I don't know how much time you have for us. It's already 23 minutes moving down since the show started. I don't know how much time you have.
Go ahead. If you have a few more questions, go right ahead, Albert. I haven't spoken to you for over 30, 40 years. So what's a few minutes?
Listen, Dr. Andre, on behalf of my wife, I just want to say she said hello, and she's there in the background, and presumably we're going smooth sailing. I'm not hearing any feedback now. I've found out the reason. As long as you can hear me, but I'm a big fan of yours. You know that.
Well, thank you very much. Again, as I said, we have to be a big fan of each other because, as you know, because you are an accomplished writer, sometimes writing is a lonely occupation. Well, I am happy to see that.
I have 5 of your tomes. They're not just little books.
I'm
They're
happy to
huge
see that.
books.
We have, and the thing is, we have to continue writing because you know, and I know, there will be no white knight coming on a horse to Dominica.
You do it for us. That's right.
There we go. We have to do it ourselves, irrespective of whether you agree with this interpretation or that. We have an obligation to write. And I'm happy to say that in Distant Voices, which I wrote about the indigenous literature in Dominica, I'm
Right.
happy that I could have featured you because, again, you've been on the forefront of the literary consciousness of Dominicans. And I certainly encourage, I should indicate, not with Temple behind you, but beside you. And I certainly
Well,
hope that you continue your work because it's
Tempe is
good work.
also
An
Tempe is
accomplished
also
writer.
a published author as well.
Wonderful stuff. Wonderful stuff. We
Yeah.
need more creative couples such
Creative
as
couples.
Tempe and yourself. Keep on doing it. Keep on trucking.
Thank you. But do you know how many books you have written? Because you've written so many of them. There's biographies, anthologies. There's books on cricket. There's books on prime ministers.
That's true. You know what?
As well as Distant Voices and Frank Barron and so forth.
Well, I've written.
What's your catalog like?
I think it's about 26, 27, but who's counting?
That's right.
Who's counting? I'm working on a biography of another Dominican Prime Minister, the great Edison Chenfield James.
Okay.
He's been misunderstood, and I regard it as my duty, as best as I can, to document the life stories, the experiences, Dominica's development or lack thereof. It seems to me that those who have the time and probably some resources to do so. With respect to the ROSIE book, as I told you, a publishing company in Toronto basically offered me a little contract to republish the book. I basically did some additional research. I edited it to make it more relevant to a Canadian reading public. And I'm happy to say that it will be published on about November 3rd of this year. The significance, obviously, of November 3rd is that that is the day we celebrate our national independence.
That's
So
right.
I hope to be involved in that and so on. And probably at some point when I have some vacation, I will go to Dominica and have a book presentation. Dominica, I can tell you, and that is a good thing, Albert, from the days when you used to write and you used to go about selling your books of poetry, I think Dominica has progressed. I think there are many more persons in Dominica reading literature produced by Dominicans and collecting works. There are many students abroad, whether in America, whether in England. I get requests from about this particular aspect or this particular topic or this and so on. And I think that augurs very well for the future. So let me say this, to borrow a phrase from Michael Jackson: you are not alone, Albert Temple. And let me commend you on the book you did about Ras Kabinda. It's great work. As you know, I did a little chapter, again, derived from a book I wrote about one of our former prime ministers, Patrick John, about, it is, the title of that chapter was from Papadocracy to Democracy.
Yeah, I saw it on Academia.
That's right, academia.edu. I can tell you that I have been revising that chapter because I interviewed a number of persons who were Rastafarians at the time. And it is my view, it is my task to revise that upwards and probably at some point to get it into a booklet to give a more expansive account of what Rastafarians had to contend with in the 70s in Dominica.
Okay, Irving. Well, let's take a minute to refresh ourselves, get our act together, and then you come back and give some closing remarks. Is that all right?
Wonderful. Thanks, my friend.
Okay.
Rastafari Revelation. Rastafari Revelation.
Okay, Irving, we're back again.
Yes.
I would just want to thank you for taking some time out to be on the podcast. I think short and sweet is better than long and boring. We hope that our viewers had a chance to reflect with us on the 23rd anniversary of the passing of Brother Rosie Douglas. It's a great pleasure to have you on the show as an author of a book exploring his life and exploring his philosophies and his activities. And we also want to take this opportunity to thank you and to ask you to keep up the good work. Always let us know what's happening in your neck of the woods in terms of the arts, in terms of the literature. We're standing by to lend our strength to the struggle. The struggle goes on, and it's just a matter of just networking, So Irving, the last word is yours.
Well, let me thank you once again, Albert and Tempe. As I said, I commend both of you for the wonderful work you're doing. Let me indicate to your listeners that there's a significance behind the title of your show, Four Corners. In the 1970s, there was a part of Roseau, Dominica's capital, where unemployed youth, those who had been relegated to the sidelines, they convened and they became the target of state agents who felt that they were subversive. Many of them had dreadlocks, and they became the victims, in my view, of state persecution. And it seems to me that your dedication to keeping the history alive is manifested in the title to your program, and I commend you for that. And again, I thank our listeners for lending us some of their time. And I certainly look forward to the day when we can meet on neutral ground and we can talk further and we can probably attend at one of these research facilities in England so that we can gain some more insight into our own history and we can be encouraged to write even more than we've already written. So, Albert, thank you. You're a wonderful Dominican, a true ambassador, and I hope that you will get that recognition from your island of origin, even if you are thousands of miles away. So good afternoon to you, my friend, and thank you very much.